I never thought the silence after my mother's funeral would be broken this way. Not by time, not by healing, but by the people I trusted most. It started so quietly, I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. A drawer in my childhood bedroom, slightly ajar when I knew I'd closed it. Mail at my apartment opened before I could touch it. The faint smell of cologne that wasn't my husband's lingering in our hallway long after I'd been out all afternoon. Then it became impossible to ignore. My brother's wife, Amanda, began treating my home like an extension of her own, coming and going as she pleased, touching what she wanted, deciding what I should or shouldn't keep. When I finally confronted her, calmly and carefully, she didn't apologize. She laughed. She told me I was overreacting, that I was grieving poorly, that I should be grateful someone cared enough to check on me. My brother stood right beside her and said nothing. That silence hurt more than her words. I realized then that I was no longer a sister to be respected, but an obstacle to be managed. So I stopped arguing. I stopped pleading. I stopped explaining myself. Instead, I did something they never expected. I disappeared from their reach. Without warning, without drama, without a single goodbye. What happened 2 weeks later, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday morning, would force them to face consequences they never believed could touch them. This is not just a story about betrayal or humiliation or revenge. It's a story about patience, about knowing when to step back, and about how quiet decisions can lead to the loudest justice. Stay with me, because the truth of what happened next turned their world upside down, and the ending was more satisfying than they could ever imagine. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. My name is Catherine Morrison, and I'm 39 years old. I work as a senior architect at a design firm in Portland, Oregon, a job I worked 15 years to earn, designing buildings that would outlast me by generations. But the structure I cared about most was my family, and 6 months ago, when my mother Diane passed away after a long battle with cancer, I learned that some foundations crack no matter how carefully you build them. The morning after her funeral, I made coffee in the same ceramic mug I'd used since college, a chipped white cup with faded purple flowers painted on the side. My mother had given it to me when I moved into my first apartment, along with a note that said, "May your mornings always be warm." I hated how fragile it looked, how easily it could break. Now I couldn't imagine drinking from anything else. That first morning alone, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the empty chair across from me. For years, that's where my mother would sit during her weekend visits, complaining about the traffic from Seattle, praising whatever meal I'd attempted to cook, asking about my work with genuine interest. She would never sit there again. She would never ask me anything again. She would never ask me anything again. Grief, I discovered, is not a storm that passes. It's a river that runs beneath everything. Quiet most days, but always there. I didn't drown in it. My mother wouldn't have wanted that. Instead, I learned to live alongside it, to let the current carry me forward even when I wanted to stand still. End of. Change guest. Shech dust. Paragraph. Grief. Солмена подстарякан. Вен. Enge guti. Vanistang fung. Dan. Dieni. Just markima samani. Seng. Darianiani. Endani. Ja iniamo pekza. Pohot. Bed. Batiat. Sen. Dalmukeakieni. Ziai. Balmu. Taeni. I kept her favorite jasmine plant on my windowsill and watered it every morning the way she used to. I took walks through the neighborhood at dawn, nodding to the same faces, following the same route we'd walked together during her visits. I ate dinner at 7, read until 10, and slept on my side of the bed, leaving space for my husband Marcus, even though he worked night shifts at the hospital 3 times a week. My life became a series of rituals, small acts of remembrance that kept my mother close without letting sorrow consume me. She had always been the organizer in our family, the one who planned holidays, managed finances, even labeled the spices in alphabetical order. She used to joke that if anything happened to her, my father would be lost within a week because he didn't know where she kept the checkbook. She was probably right. After she passed, I found notes tucked into drawers and folders, little instructions she'd written just in case. How to restart the water heater at the house in Seattle. Which neighbor had a spare key? The name of her favorite florist for when we inevitably forgot important dates. She had prepared for everything, even her own absence. She'd even written birthday cards for me months in advance, sealed and dated, so I'd have something to open each year. I found the first one 2 weeks after the funeral. Hidden in a box of her belongings my father had asked me to sort through. I sat on my bedroom floor and cried for an hour. There was one envelope I never opened. It sat in the back of that same box, unmarked and slightly yellowed. I noticed it several times while searching for other things, but something always stopped me. Perhaps I wasn't ready. Perhaps I was afraid of what she might have written. Some messages are meant to be read at the right moment, and I'd learned to trust my mother's timing, even from beyond. My brother Julian visited occasionally, always with his wife Amanda. They came as a pair, never separately, and I told myself this was normal. Married couples do things together. But I noticed that Julian rarely spoke when Amanda was in the room. She filled the silence for both of them, asking about my health, my work schedule, my daily routines. She wanted to know if I was eating well, sleeping well, managing my responsibilities. Her concern seemed genuine, wrapped in soft words and sympathetic smiles. But sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, I caught her glancing around my apartment with an expression I couldn't quite name. It wasn't worry. It was something else, something that made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. I dismissed it as paranoia. She was my sister-in-law. She was family. What reason would she have to be anything but kind? That Thursday morning, I left for my walk at 6:30 sharp, locking the door behind me the way I always did. I checked the handle twice, a habit my mother used to tease me about. The air was crisp, the sidewalks damp from overnight rain, and I followed my usual route past the coffee shop and through the park. When I returned 50 minutes later, I reached for my keys and stopped. The door was unlocked. I stood there for a long moment, hand hovering over the knob, trying to remember if I'd forgotten. But I hadn't forgotten. I never forgot. Someone had been inside my home. I stepped inside slowly, scanning the room for anything out of place. The apartment looked the same as I'd left it. The coffee mug sat in the drying rack. The morning paper lay folded on the table. My mother's jasmine plant stood undisturbed on the windowsill, its white flowers catching the light. Nothing seemed wrong, and yet everything felt different. There was a faint trace of perfume in the air, something floral and chemical, nothing like what I wore, gone almost as soon as I noticed it. I told myself I was imagining things. Grief plays tricks on the mind. But the door had been unlocked, and I had not unlocked it. Over the following weeks, the small disturbances multiplied. I would leave a drawer closed and return to find it slightly ajar. I would place my laptop charger on the left side of my desk, and later, it would be on the right. My mail arrived already opened, the envelope slit cleanly along the top, as if by a letter opener I didn't own. At first, I blamed myself. Memory plays tricks after loss, and I wasn't too proud to admit that I occasionally forgot where I'd put my keys or whether I'd taken my vitamins. But these were different. These felt deliberate, as if someone was rearranging the pieces of my life, just enough to make me doubt my own mind. The photograph bothered me most. My mother and I had taken a picture together on her 65th birthday, standing in front of the Japanese garden she loved in Seattle. I kept it on the shelf beside my reading chair, angled so I could see her face when I sat down in the evenings. One night, I noticed the frame had moved. It now faced the wall, my mother's smile hidden from view. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember if I'd turned it myself. I had not. I was certain. But certainty felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. When Julian and Amanda visited that Sunday, I considered mentioning the disturbances. But before I could speak, Amanda was already talking, filling the room with questions about my health and my schedule, and whether I'd remembered to pay my car insurance on time. She moved through my kitchen as if it belonged to her, opening cabinets, checking expiration dates, clucking her tongue at a carton of almond milk that was 3 days past its date. "Catherine, I noticed some of your mail was piling up," she said, her voice dripping with sweetness. "I hope you don't mind, but I opened a few envelopes just to make sure you weren't missing any important bills. When you're grieving, it's easy to overlook things." I felt the words land like small stones against my chest. When you're grieving, as if my mother's death 6 months ago had erased my ability to manage my own affairs. I'd been handling my finances since I was 22. I'd negotiated million-dollar construction contracts, and now she was opening my mail because she worried I might forget to pay the electric bill? "I appreciate the concern," I said carefully, "but I'd prefer to handle my own correspondence." Amanda smiled, the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Of course, Catherine. I was just trying to help. You know how much we worry about you living here all alone while Marcus is working those long shifts. We just want to make sure you're okay." I looked at Julian, hoping he might say something. He sat on the couch, hands folded in his lap, staring at a spot on the carpet. He didn't meet my eyes. He didn't speak. When Amanda finished her sentence, he nodded slightly, as if agreeing with words he hadn't heard. I realized then that I couldn't remember the last time my brother had visited without his wife. Every conversation, every meal, every holiday, Amanda was always there. Speaking for both of them, filling silences before Julian could fill them himself. "Julian," I said, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Before he could answer, Amanda appeared at his side, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Is everything okay, Catherine? You can tell us both. We're family." Julian glanced up at me, then quickly looked away. It was something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Not guilt exactly, but something close to it. Discomfort, avoidance. The look of someone who knew more than he was willing to say. "It's nothing," I said. "Never mind." After they left, I sat alone in the silence, turning the conversation over in my mind. I wanted to believe that Amanda's attention came from a place of love. I wanted to believe my brother's silence was simply shyness or deference to his wife, or the awkwardness that sometimes grows between siblings. But the unlocked door, the opened mail, the moved photograph, these were not accidents. Someone was entering my home without permission, and the only people with a reason to do so were the only family I had left in Portland. That night, I went to the box where I kept my mother's letters. I had saved every card and note she'd ever written me, bundled together with a silk ribbon she'd worn in her hair at my wedding. I kept them in chronological order, a paper timeline of our relationship. When I opened the box, the ribbon was untied. The letters were scattered, some facing the wrong direction, others clearly moved from their original positions. Someone had read them. Someone had held my mother's words in their hands without my permission, had touched the private memories I guarded more carefully than anything else I owned. I sat on the edge of my bed, the letters trembling in my fingers, and felt something cold settle in my chest. This was not forgetfulness. This was not paranoia. Someone was searching through my life, and I didn't yet know why. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Marcus's steady breathing beside me. He'd come home from his shift at 2 a.m, exhausted and smelling faintly of antiseptic. I'd pretended to be asleep, not wanting to burden him with suspicions I couldn't yet prove. I tried to convince myself there was an innocent explanation. Perhaps I had untied the ribbon myself and forgotten. Perhaps the letters had shifted when I opened the box too quickly. But I knew these were lies I was telling myself, to avoid a harder truth. Someone had violated the most sacred space I had left, the place where my mother still lived in ink and paper, and I could no longer pretend it was an accident. The next morning, I called Julian and asked him to come over alone. I emphasized the word twice, and there was a pause on the other end of the line before he agreed. When he arrived 3 hours later, Amanda was with him. She smiled at me from the doorway, as if her presence was the most natural thing in the world, as if I hadn't specifically requested privacy with my own brother. "I hope you don't mind," she said, stepping inside before I could respond. "Julian mentioned he wanted to talk, and I thought it might be helpful if we were both here. Family discussions are better when everyone's involved, don't you think?" I didn't think that, but I let them in anyway. Refusing would have created a confrontation I wasn't yet ready to have. We sat in the living room, Amanda on the couch beside Julian, me in my chair across from them. The photograph of my mother and me at the Japanese garden had been turned back to face the room. I didn't remember moving it. "I need to ask you something," I said, looking directly at Julian. "And I need you to answer honestly." Julian shifted uncomfortably. Amanda placed her hand on his knee, a gesture that might have looked supportive, but felt like a warning. "Who has been entering my apartment?" The question hung in the air. Julian's eyes flickered toward Amanda, then back to the carpet. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. "Catherine," Amanda began, "I'm not sure what you mean. We visit when we can, but we always—" "I'm asking Julian." My voice was firmer than I intended, but I didn't apologize. I kept my eyes on my brother, waiting. He looked like a man caught between two opposing forces, unable to move in either direction. Finally, he spoke. "I gave Amanda a spare key," he said quietly, "a few months ago, so she could check on you when we were worried." The words landed with more weight than he probably intended. A spare key, given without my knowledge, without my permission, to someone who was not my family by blood, only by marriage. I thought about all the small disturbances, the open mail, the moved photograph, the scattered letters. It had been Amanda all along, coming and going as she pleased, treating my apartment like an extension of her own. "You gave her a key to my home," I said slowly. "And you didn't think to ask me first?" Julian's face flushed. "I was trying to help, Catherine. You're alone so much with Marcus working nights and we worry. What if something happened to you? What if you fell and couldn't reach the phone? Then you would call, or you would knock, or you would ask me if I wanted someone to have access to my private space." I heard my voice rising and forced myself to stay calm. "This is not about a key, Julian. This is about respect. You made a decision about my life without including me in it. You gave your wife permission to enter my home whenever she wanted, and you never once thought to mention it." Amanda leaned forward, her expression shifting into something softer, more sympathetic. "Catherine, please don't be upset. We were only trying to look out for you. You're grieving. You're alone most evenings. It's natural for family to want to make sure you're safe." There it was again. You're grieving. As if my mother's death was a disease that stripped away my right to privacy, my ability to make decisions, my dignity as a woman who'd lived nearly 4 decades without needing supervision. "I want the key back," I said. Amanda blinked. "Excuse me?" "The key. I want it returned, today." She glanced at Julian, who said nothing. Then she smiled, the same smile she always wore, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Of course, Catherine. I completely understand. I'll bring it by next time we visit." "Not next time. Now." Another pause. Amanda's smile flickered just for a moment before settling back into place. "I don't have it with me. I left it at home. But I promise I'll return it, soon." I didn't believe her, but I let it go. Pressing further would only create more resistance, and I needed time to think. Instead, I set a boundary I hoped they would honor. "From now on," I said, "I would appreciate it if you called before coming over. I don't like surprises." "Of course," Amanda said smoothly. "Whatever makes you comfortable, Catherine." Julia nodded along, still avoiding my eyes. They left 20 minutes later, full of reassurances and promises that felt as thin as paper. I watched them drive away, and knew with absolute certainty that nothing would change. Amanda would keep the key, she would keep coming, and Julian would keep silent, caught in a web he'd helped weave but couldn't escape. That night, I checked every lock in the apartment twice. I examined the windows, tested the deadbolt, and placed a chair against the door before going to bed. Then I took a small notebook from my desk, the kind I used to carry on job sites for quick calculations, and opened it to the first page. I wrote the date at the top. Below it, I wrote a single word: Thursday. It was the day I discovered my mother's letters disturbed. It was the day I stopped trusting my brother's wife. And it was the beginning of something I didn't yet fully understand. A week passed before the key was returned. Amanda dropped it off on a Sunday afternoon, pressing it into my palm with a smile that suggested she was doing me a great favor. She didn't apologize for the delay. She didn't acknowledge that the key should never have been made in the first place. She simply handed it over and said, "There you go, Catherine. Happy now?" I was not happy, but I thanked her anyway, because that's what polite people do. I put the key in my pocket and told myself the matter was closed. I wanted to believe that boundaries, once stated, would be respected. I wanted to believe that my brother's wife, whatever her flaws, would honor a simple request from a woman who'd never asked for much. I was wrong. The following Wednesday, I returned from my morning walk to find the scent of fresh coffee in the air. I hadn't made coffee before leaving. I checked the kitchen and found a clean mug in the drying rack, still warm to the touch. Someone had been here. Someone had used my coffee maker, drunk from my cups, and left before I returned. I stood in the middle of my own kitchen and felt that familiar chill crawl up my spine. The key was in my pocket. The locks hadn't been changed, which meant either Amanda had made a copy before returning the original, or she'd found another way inside. I called Julian that evening and asked to speak with both of them. This time I didn't request privacy. I knew Amanda would come regardless, and I wanted to confront her directly, with witnesses, so there could be no misunderstanding. They arrived together, as always. Amanda wore a concerned expression that I now recognized as performance, a mask she put on whenever she wanted to appear caring. Julian looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a weight you cannot put down. They sat across from me in the living room, and I didn't offer them coffee. "I need to be clear about something," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I do not want anyone entering my apartment without my knowledge or permission. Not to check on me, not to help with bills, not for any reason. If you're worried about my safety, you can call. If I don't answer, you can contact the building manager. But I do not want anyone walking into my home while I'm not here." Amanda tilted her head, a gesture of exaggerated confusion. "Catherine, what are you talking about? I gave the key back. I haven't been here since. Someone made coffee in my kitchen this morning. I did not make it." She laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an embarrassed laugh. A dismissive one. The kind of laugh you might give a child who insists there are monsters under the bed. "Catherine, you're being overly sensitive. Maybe you made it and forgot. That happens when you're grieving and stressed. Memory gets fuzzy." There it was again. When you're grieving. The phrase she used like a weapon, designed to make me doubt myself, to convince me that my perceptions couldn't be trusted. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. "I did not forget," I said. "I know what I did and did not do this morning." "Of course you do," she said, her tone dripping with false reassurance. "I'm just saying, we're family. This is what family does. We look out for each other. If I did stop by, which I didn't, it would only be because I care about you." I turned to Julian. He stood beside his wife, hands in his pockets, staring at a point somewhere above my left shoulder. He would not meet my eyes. "Julian," I said, "do you have anything to say?" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I watched him struggle, watched the conflict play out across his face. For a moment, I thought he might actually speak up, might actually defend his sister against the slow erosion of her dignity. But the moment passed. "She means well, Catherine," he said quietly. "We both do." The silence that followed hurt more than Amanda's laughter. My own brother, the boy I'd grown up with, the man I'd supported through college and career troubles, and the early years of his marriage, could not find the words to stand beside me. He had chosen his wife's convenience over his sister's peace of mind. And he didn't even have the courage to admit it. Amanda broke the silence with a question that caught me off guard. "By the way, Catherine, do you need any help managing your finances? I've been thinking about it, and with everything you have to keep track of, your job, this apartment, Mom's estate, it might be easier if someone assisted you. Julian's been stressed about money lately, and I thought maybe we could all help each other." I saw Julian flinch at the mention of money. His jaw tightened, and for just a second, something flashed in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or shame. He recovered quickly, but I noticed. I always noticed. 15 years of reading architectural plans and spotting structural weaknesses had taught me to see what others missed. "I am perfectly capable of managing my own finances," I said firmly. "Thank you for the offer, but I do not need assistance." Amanda smiled and let the subject drop, but the question lingered in my mind long after they left. Why would she ask about my finances? Why would Julian flinch at the word money? There was something beneath the surface, something they weren't telling me. But I didn't have enough information yet to understand what it was. That night, I sat at my desk with the notebook I'd started keeping. I turned to a fresh page and began writing in earnest. I recorded the date, the time I'd left for my walk, the time I'd returned, and what I'd found. The warm mug, the smell of coffee. A feeling of violation that had become my constant companion. I documented every detail I could remember, every small disturbance from the past weeks, every instance where something felt wrong, even if I couldn't prove it. At the bottom of the page, I wrote a single sentence in capital letters. "If I am overreacting, prove it." It was a challenge to myself as much as to anyone else. I would keep records. I would gather evidence. And when the time came, I would know whether I was a paranoid grieving woman or a victim of something I had not yet named. 4 months, 19 entries. I filled page after page in that notebook, each line a record of violation, each date proof that I was not imagining things. The pattern became undeniable once I had enough data to see it. Amanda came during my morning walks, almost always between 6:45 and 7:15. She stayed 20 to 40 minutes, never longer. She focused on specific areas: my desk, my filing cabinet, the drawer where I kept important documents. She was not checking on my health. She was not watering plants or tidying up out of kindness. She was searching for something, methodically, repeatedly, and she believed I would never notice. I began varying my routine to test the pattern. Some mornings I left earlier than usual. Other mornings I returned by a different route, cutting through the back entrance of the building to avoid being seen from the street. The entries continued regardless. Amanda had learned my habits well enough to predict my movements. But she hadn't anticipated that I would start watching hers. The confirmation came from an unexpected source. My neighbor across the hall, a retired teacher named Gloria Chen, knocked on my door one afternoon with a plate of cookies and an expression that told me she hadn't come just to be neighborly. "Catherine," she said, settling into the chair I offered, "I need to tell you something, and I hope you won't think I'm meddling." I assured her I wouldn't. "I've seen her," Gloria said, lowering her voice. "Your sister-in-law. Almost every morning when you leave for your walk, she comes in through the main entrance, lets herself into your apartment, and stays for half an hour or so. I thought maybe you knew, maybe you'd asked her to check on things. But then I saw your face last week and you came back early, and I knew something was wrong." I sat very still, absorbing her words. Part of me had hoped I was wrong, that there was some explanation I'd overlooked. Gloria's confirmation destroyed that hope. "She has her own key," Gloria continued. "I've seen her use it. She doesn't knock. She doesn't call first. She just walks in like she owns the place. She paused, her weathered hands folded tightly in her lap. You're one of the kindest people I know, Catherine. Whatever she's doing, it's not right. I thanked Gloria for telling me. She left shortly after, and I sat alone with the weight of what she'd confirmed. 19 unauthorized entries, witnessed by a neighbor who had no reason to lie. This was not paranoia. This was not grief-related confusion. This was a sustained invasion of my privacy, and I needed to decide what to do about it. The next day, I took a bus to an electronics store on the other side of town. I didn't want to shop anywhere Amanda might see me, anywhere word might get back to Julian. I spent an hour browsing the aisles, asking questions, comparing options. When I left, I carried a small bag containing something that fit easily in my coat pocket. The receipt I tucked into my notebook, along with a printout of Oregon's tenant rights and the legal definition of criminal trespass. I wasn't yet ready to act, but I wanted to be prepared when the time came. The following Sunday, Julian and Amanda visited for dinner. I'd ordered takeout rather than cook, a small economy of effort that Amanda immediately criticized. Catherine, you should be eating home-cooked meals, she said, picking at the container of pad thai with evident distaste. Takeout is full of sodium. It's not good for someone dealing with as much stress as you are. I let the comment pass without response. I'd learned that arguing with Amanda only gave her more ammunition, more opportunities to paint me as difficult or unreasonable or incapable. Better to stay silent and let her reveal herself. She waited until we'd finished eating to deliver what I now believe was the true purpose of the visit. She reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of glossy brochures, spreading them across my dining table like a hand of cards. I've been doing some research, she said brightly, and I think it might be time to consider other living arrangements. These assisted living communities are wonderful. They have activities, medical staff on site, people your own age to socialize with. You wouldn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning or maintaining this big apartment all by yourself. And with Marcus working such crazy hours, it might give you both some peace of mind. I looked at the brochures, sunny photographs of smiling residents, promises of care and community and security, and beneath it all, the unspoken message: you are too fragile to live alone. You are too broken to be trusted. Give us control, and we will take care of everything. I looked at my brother. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I didn't respond to the brochures. I gathered them into a neat pile, thanked Amanda for her concern, and showed them to the door with the practiced politeness of a woman who had run out of words. Julian mumbled something about calling later in the week. Amanda reminded me to think seriously about my options. I closed the door behind them and stood in the silence of my apartment, feeling the walls pressing in around me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed beside Marcus, who'd fallen asleep within minutes of coming home from his shift, and replayed the conversation in my mind. Assisted living, activities, people your own age, as if I were a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed, an inconvenience that would be easier to handle if I simply disappeared into a facility where someone else could worry about me. I'd built a career from nothing. I'd designed buildings that would stand for generations. I'd survived losses that would have broken weaker people. And now my sister-in-law was handing me brochures, as if I were no longer capable of deciding where to live. Well, sometime after midnight, I got out of bed and went to the box where I'd kept my mother's things. I'd avoided the unmarked envelope for 6 months, telling myself I wasn't ready, telling myself there would be a right moment. But the right moment had never come, and I was tired of waiting for permission to read my own mother's words. The envelope was yellowed at the edges, sealed with the care my mother brought to everything she did. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the slight weight of something inside beyond just paper. My name was written on the front in her familiar handwriting, the loops and curves I'd seen on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the notes she'd left in my lunchbox when I was a child. I ran my finger along the letters, tracing the shape of her presence one last time. Then I opened it. Inside, I found 2 things. The first was her old library card, laminated and worn from years of use. My mother had loved the library more than almost anywhere else. She used to say that books were the only thing worth hoarding, the only possessions that gave back more than they took. We'd spent countless Saturday afternoons wandering the stacks together when I was young, her searching for novels, me pretending to browse while really just watching her face light up each time she found something new. The card was a simple memento, but holding it felt like holding a piece of our life together, a reminder of who we'd been before illness and loss and time had changed everything. The second item was a letter, written on the pale blue stationery she kept in her desk. I unfolded it slowly, afraid of what I might find, afraid of what I might feel. Her handwriting was slightly uneven, the letters formed with effort. I realized she must have written this near the end, when her strength was fading, but her mind remained sharp. I read the words once, then again, then a third time, each reading cutting deeper than the last. P. Strong, Catherine. I see you reading this. You're probably feeling alone. I know your brother loves you, but I also know your sister-in-law. I've seen how she looks at our family's assets, at what we've built. I've watched her calculate the value of things that should have no price. I hoped I was wrong. I hoped I was wrong. I hoped that after I was gone, she would treat you with the respect you deserve. End P. But if you're reading this letter, I suspect my hopes were misplaced. And don't let anyone take your dignity. You've spent your whole life being kind, being patient, being the woman who keeps the peace, even when peace costs too much. But there are some things worth more than peace. Your self-respect is one of them. Your right to live on your own terms is another. End P. If your boundaries are violated, walk away. Don't explain. End P. Don't beg for understanding. Don't waste your breath on people who have already decided not to hear you. Just walk away. You owe no one an apology for protecting yourself. Don't live someone else's life for them. I made that mistake with your brother more times than I can count, and look where it led him. To a woman who sees him as a means to an end. I believe in you, I always have, and wherever I am now, I'm still believing in you. All my love, forever and after, Mom. I sat on the edge of my bed, the letter trembling in my hands, and felt something break open inside me. The tears came without warning, the first I'd shed since the day we buried her. I cried for my mother who had seen the truth and tried to warn me. I cried for Julian, the brother I'd grown up with, who couldn't find the courage to stand beside his sister. I cried for myself, for the months I'd spent doubting my own perceptions, wondering if I was paranoid, wondering if I was losing my mind. I'd been so afraid of conflict, so desperate to preserve what remained of my family, that I'd sacrificed the very thing my mother had asked me to protect, my dignity, my boundaries, my right to live without apology. I didn't know how long I sat there. When the tears finally stopped, I felt hollowed out but strangely clear, as if a fog had lifted and I could see the landscape of my life for the first time in months. My mother had known. She'd always known, and she'd prepared this letter like a lighthouse, waiting for the moment when I would need its light to find my way home. I walked to the living room and stood before her photograph, the one from the Japanese garden, the one Amanda had turned to face the wall. I looked at my mother's face, at the smile I'd loved for 39 years, and I spoke to her as if she could hear me. "You were right," I whispered. "I've been a fool." The apartment was silent, but I could have sworn I felt something shift in the air, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. I picked up my phone from the coffee table and opened my messages. My fingers hovered over the screen for a long moment. Then I began to type. The message I typed was simple. I didn't explain my reasons or justify my decision. I didn't apologize for the inconvenience it might cause. I wrote exactly what I meant, and nothing more. I'm changing the locks on my apartment. From now on, please do not enter when I'm not present. If you need to see me, call first. I sent it to both Julian and Amanda. Then I set the phone down on the table and waited. My mother's letter lay beside me, her words still echoing in my mind. Don't explain. Don't beg for understanding. Just walk away. I'd spent 6 months explaining. 6 months hoping that reasonable requests would be met with reasonable compliance. That approach had failed. Now I would try something different. Now I would act. The phone rang within 2 minutes. Amanda's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering, giving myself time to steady my breathing, to prepare for whatever came next. "Catherine, what is this about?" Her voice was sharp, the false sweetness stripped away. "Don't you trust us, after everything we've done for you?" I'd anticipated this question. I'd rehearsed my response while typing the message, knowing she'd try to reframe the conversation, to make it about trust or gratitude or family obligation. I didn't take the bait. "This isn't about trust," I said calmly. "This is about boundaries." "Boundaries? We're your family, Catherine. We don't need boundaries. We need to know you're safe." "I am safe. I'm also entitled to privacy in my own home." She tried again, her tone shifting between wounded and accusatory. She asked if someone had been filling my head with ideas. She suggested I was being influenced by neighbors who didn't understand our family dynamics. She reminded me of all the times she'd checked on me, all the times she'd made sure I was eating properly and managing my responsibilities. Each argument was designed to make me feel ungrateful, unreasonable, difficult. I listened without interrupting. When she finally paused to draw breath, I said only this: "I've made my decision. Please respect it." Then I hung up. It was the first time in my life I'd ever ended a call with family. My hand trembled slightly as I set the phone down, but beneath the tremor, I felt something unexpected: relief. I'd drawn a line. I'd spoken clearly and without equivocation. Whatever came next, I'd done what my mother asked. I'd protected my dignity. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had new locks installed on both doors. I paid in cash and kept the receipt. Then I drove to Julian's house, hoping to speak with him alone, to explain my decision in person before Amanda could poison the conversation. I wanted to give my brother a chance to understand, to choose his sister over his wife's displeasure, even if only for a moment. When I arrived, Amanda's car was in the driveway. I sat in my own car for several minutes, debating whether to knock anyway. Through the front window, I could see shadows moving, and when I rolled down my window, I heard voices drifting from somewhere inside the house. The words were indistinct, muffled by walls and distance, but the tone was clear. They were arguing. About what? I couldn't say. But I heard my name mentioned once, sharp and accusatory, followed by a long silence. I decided not to knock. Whatever conversation was happening inside, my presence would only make it worse. Julian needed space to process what I'd done, to decide for himself whether he would support his sister or side with his wife. Forcing a confrontation now would only push him further into Amanda's corner. I would return another day, when the emotions had cooled, when we could speak without her shadow looming over us. I drove home slowly, taking the long route through neighborhoods my mother and I used to walk together. The cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom, pink and white against a clear blue sky. I thought about all the seasons we'd shared, all the changes we'd weathered together. She'd been my compass for 39 years. Now I was learning to navigate alone, guided only by the letter she'd left behind. That evening, I retrieved the small device I'd purchased at the electronics store. It was a motion-activated camera, no larger than a deck of cards, designed to blend into a bookshelf or sit unnoticed among ordinary objects. I'd researched my options carefully, choosing a model that recorded to an internal memory card, rather than requiring an internet connection. I didn't want anyone to know I was watching. I placed the camera on the third shelf of my bookcase, nestled between a row of design manuals and a framed photograph of my mother and me at my college graduation. The lens pointed directly at the entrance, capturing anyone who walked through the door. I tested it twice, walking in and out of the apartment, reviewing the footage on my laptop to ensure the angle was correct. When I was satisfied, I turned off the lights and went to bed. The camera sat in the darkness, silent and patient, waiting for whatever would come next. 3 days passed before I returned to Julian's house. I wanted to give him time, to let the anger from my message settle into something more manageable. I still believed, despite everything, that my brother might choose differently if given the chance. I still hoped that somewhere beneath Amanda's influence, the boy I'd grown up with still existed, waiting for permission to emerge. It was a Saturday afternoon when I drove back. The weather had turned gray, clouds hanging low over the rooftops. The kind of day my mother used to call funking weather. I parked across the street, a few houses down, where I could see Julian's driveway without being immediately visible from the front windows. Amanda's car was there again, but this time I didn't leave. I'd driven too far to turn back without trying. I walked up the path slowly, rehearsing what I would say. I wanted to be calm, reasonable, the sister Julian remembered from before our mother's death. I wanted to offer an olive branch, a chance to repair what had been broken. But as I approached the front door, I heard voices drifting through an open window on the side of the house, the same window that had been cracked open during my last visit. I stopped. The voices were clearer now, close enough to distinguish words. I knew I should keep walking, should knock on the door and announce myself like a decent person. But something held me in place, some instinct born of 6 months of doubt and documentation. I moved closer to the window, staying out of sight, and listened. Amanda spoke first. She changed the locks. Can you believe it? After everything we've done, she changed the locks like we're strangers. She's being ridiculous. I waited for Julian to defend me. I waited for him to say that I had a right to privacy, that his wife had overstepped, that perhaps they should respect my wishes. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then my brother spoke. My sister, she's not the one making decisions anymore. Since Mom died, she just exists. She goes through the motions, but she's not really there. Give it time. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not the one making decisions anymore. Just exists. I pressed my hand against the wall of the house to steady myself, my heart pounding in my ears. Amanda's voice came again, lower now, almost conspiratorial. That apartment is too big for one person. 2 bedrooms, a study, all that space going to waste. If she would just be reasonable. Just wait until she's weaker, Julian said. She can't hold out forever. Eventually she'll need help, and then we can have a real conversation about her living situation. I stood frozen beneath that window, unable to move, unable to breathe. The word echoed in my mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Weaker. My brother was waiting for me to become weaker, not out of concern for my well-being, not out of love for his sister, but because weakness would make me easier to manage, easier to move, easier to strip of everything I'd built. This was not dismissal. This was not the casual cruelty of a sister-in-law who didn't know better. This was a plan, spoken aloud in the safety of their own home, between a husband and wife who'd calculated the trajectory of my decline and were simply waiting for gravity to do its work. I thought of all the times Julian had stood silent while Amanda criticized me. I thought of his averted eyes, his shrugged shoulders, his mumbled agreements. I'd attributed his behavior to weakness, to the difficulty of being caught between a wife and a sister. But weakness was not the same as complicity. Weakness did not speak of waiting until someone was weaker. My brother had not been caught in the middle. He'd chosen his side long ago. He'd simply lacked the courage to tell me. I didn't knock on the door. I didn't confront them. I turned and walked back to my car, my footsteps silent on the concrete path, my face betraying nothing to anyone who might have been watching. I drove home slowly, taking streets I hadn't traveled in years, letting the unfamiliar routes give me time to process what I'd heard. I didn't cry. The tears I'd shed over my mother's letter had emptied something inside me, leaving a space that now filled with something harder, something clearer. I understood now why my mother had written that letter. She'd seen what I'd refused to see. She'd known that love could be corrupted, that family could become a weapon, that the people closest to you were sometimes the ones most capable of betrayal. Her letter had been a warning. My brother's words were confirmation. By the time I reached my apartment, the gray afternoon had darkened toward evening. I checked the new locks on both doors, running my fingers along the brass mechanisms I'd installed just days before. I powered on my laptop and verified that the camera on the bookshelf was recording properly, its small red light blinking in the shadows. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. I sat down in my chair, facing my mother's photograph, and let the silence settle around me. I was not angry. Anger would have been easier, would have given me something to push against, someone to blame. What I felt instead was clarity, cold and absolute, like the moment in an engineering calculation when all the variables align and you see exactly where the stress will fracture the beam. The trap was set. Not for revenge. I had no interest in punishment for its own sake. But the truth had been hiding in the shadows of my home for 6 months, and I was done waiting for it to reveal itself. If Amanda came again, I would know. If she searched my desk, my cabinets, my private papers, I would have proof. And when the time came, I would decide what to do with that proof. My mother had told me to walk away. But first, I needed to know exactly what I was walking away from. 2 weeks passed without incident. I continued my morning walks, maintained my routines, and checked the camera footage each evening before bed. The recording showed nothing but empty rooms, sunlight shifting across the floor, the occasional flicker of shadows when clouds passed overhead. Part of me wondered if Amanda had finally accepted defeat, if my new locks and clear boundaries had been enough to deter her. But I knew better. I'd heard her voice through that window. I'd heard my brother's complicity. People who wait for you to become weaker don't give up easily. The building manager, a meticulous woman named Patricia, called me on a Tuesday morning. She sounded uncomfortable, choosing her words with the care of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Miss Morrison, I wanted to let you know that someone contacted our office yesterday. A woman claiming to be your sister-in-law. She said she was worried about your safety and asked if we could let her into your apartment to check on you." I felt my grip tighten on the phone. "What did you tell her?" "I told her we couldn't do that. You left explicit instructions that no one should be given access without your direct authorization." She was persistent. She called back twice and even came to the office in person. But I held firm. "I just wanted you to know, in case she tries another approach." I thanked Patricia and asked her to continue refusing any requests, regardless of how concerned the caller might sound. She assured me she would. After I hung up, I sat for a long time staring at the wall, thinking about the lengths Amanda was willing to go. She tried the key. She tried the management. What would she try next? I didn't have to wait long to find out. Over the following days, I noticed small signs that someone was probing for weaknesses. A neighbor I barely knew, a younger woman who'd moved in a few months ago, suddenly became friendly. She stopped me in the hallway to chat, asked questions about my routine, mentioned that she'd met a lovely woman named Amanda who was so worried about me. I kept my answers vague and my expression neutral, but I understood what was happening. Amanda was gathering intelligence, building relationships, looking for any crack in the walls I'd constructed. The crack she found was the fire escape. My apartment had a small balcony overlooking the courtyard, accessible through a sliding glass door I rarely used. The adjacent unit, occupied by a tenant who traveled frequently for work, shared a connecting fire escape platform. Someone agile enough could climb from one balcony to the other without much difficulty. I'd never considered this a security risk. I'd never imagined anyone would be desperate enough to try. But desperation, I was learning, had its own logic. Julian called me on a Friday evening, his voice carrying a tension I hadn't heard before. He stumbled through the usual pleasantries, asking about my health, commenting on the weather, circling around something he couldn't quite bring himself to say. "Catherine, I wanted to check in," he finally managed. "Amanda's been stressed lately. We're going through some things." I waited for him to elaborate, He didn't. What kind of things? I asked. Just financial stuff. Nothing serious. She's been working on some investments, and they haven't panned out the way she hoped. It's put a strain on things. The word investments hung in the air between us. I thought about all the times Amanda had asked about my finances, all the times she'd searched my desk and filing cabinet. I thought about the brochures for assisted living, the questions about whether I needed help managing my affairs. A picture was beginning to form, hazy, but increasingly coherent. "Do you need help?" I asked. "If you're having money troubles, I could—" "No," Julian said quickly. Too quickly. "No, we're fine. I just wanted you to know, in case Amanda seems a little on edge. She doesn't mean anything by it." He changed the subject after that, asking about my work, whether I'd given any more thought to the assisted living options. I gave non-committal answers and let him fill the silences. When the call ended, I wrote everything down in my notebook. The date, the time, the words he'd used, financial stuff, investments that hadn't panned out, a strain on things. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew it mattered. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual, exhausted by the weight of constant vigilance. I fell asleep quickly, dreaming of my mother, of walks we'd taken decades ago, of a time when family meant safety instead of suspicion. The sound woke me at 1:47 in the morning. It was subtle, barely louder than the settling of the building, but my senses had become finely tuned over months of watching and waiting. A scrape, a creak, something that didn't belong to the normal symphony of night sounds. I lay still, listening, my heart beginning to pound. Then I remembered the camera. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and opened the app that connected to the motion-activated device on my bookshelf. The screen glowed in the darkness, showing a live feed of my living room. For a moment, I saw nothing unusual. Then, the image shifted slightly, responding to movement at the edge of the frame. Someone was on the balcony. A shadow, human-shaped, pressed against the glass of the sliding door. I watched as the figure tested the handle, found it locked, and began to work at the latch with something thin and metallic. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I simply watched, the camera recording everything, as Amanda finally revealed exactly how far she was willing to go. I watched through the phone screen as she worked at the latch, her movements practiced, methodical, the technique of someone who'd researched how to bypass a simple lock. The balcony door was old, installed decades before modern security became a concern. I'd never thought to reinforce it. That oversight was about to cost her everything. At 1:54 in the morning, the door slid open. Amanda stepped inside, her silhouette framed against the faint glow of the courtyard lights behind her. She paused at the threshold, listening, waiting for any sign that she'd been detected, and then, satisfied, she pulled out her phone and activated the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the living room as she moved toward my desk. And then, satisfied, she pulled out her phone and activated the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the living room as she moved toward my desk. She didn't know about the security system I'd installed 3 days after changing the locks, a silent alarm connected to a professional monitoring service. The motion sensors were positioned throughout the apartment, invisible in the shadows, calibrated to detect movement in specific zones. In the break. When Amanda crossed the threshold into the living room, she triggered the first sensor. The system began its silent countdown, waiting for a code that would never come. We lay in bed, watching through the camera feed, counting the seconds. 15, 20, 25. Amanda reached my desk and began opening drawers, her flashlight casting wild shadows across the walls as she searched. She pulled out files, rifled through papers, set aside documents that caught her attention. She was looking for something specific, something she believed I'd hidden, something valuable enough to justify breaking into a locked apartment in the middle of the night. The countdown reached 0. The lights came on, all at once, every bulb in the apartment blazing to life, as if the sun had risen inside my walls. A siren screamed from the control panel in the hallway, loud enough to wake the entire floor, loud enough to shatter the silence Amanda had counted on. She stumbled backward, dropping her phone, her face frozen in an expression of pure terror. For a moment, she stood paralyzed, blinded by the sudden brightness, deafened by the alarm. Then she began to move frantically, searching for the control panel, pressing buttons at random, trying to silence the sound that was announcing her crime to the entire building. She didn't know the code. She never would. I stayed in bed, listening to the chaos unfold through the thin walls of my bedroom. I heard doors opening in the hallway, neighbors shouting questions, footsteps pounding on the floor above. Someone was calling 911. Someone else was demanding to know what was happening. Through it all, the siren continued its relentless scream. A mechanical witness that could not be silenced, or bribed, or persuaded to look the other way. The police arrived in 6 minutes. I heard them before I saw them. The heavy boots in the hallway, the authoritative voices demanding that everyone stay back. I got out of bed slowly, put on my robe, and waited. There was no need to rush. Everything was proceeding exactly as I'd anticipated. A knock came at my door, firm and professional. I opened it to find a uniformed officer standing in the hallway, his hand resting on his belt, his eyes scanning past me into the apartment. Behind him, I could see Amanda sitting on the floor near my desk, her wrists in handcuffs, her face streaked with tears. Another officer stood over her, taking notes. "Miss Morrison?" the first officer asked. His nameplate read, "Hernandez. I'm Officer David Hernandez. We received a silent alarm alert from your residence. Can you tell me what happened here?" "That woman broke into my apartment," I said calmly. "She entered through the balcony door without my knowledge or permission." Amanda's head snapped up. "That's not true. I'm her sister-in-law." "I was just checking on her." And her voice was high and desperate, the voice of someone watching her carefully constructed story collapse around her. "I've always had a key. The locks were changed," I said. 2 weeks ago, she was informed in writing that she was no longer permitted to enter without my presence or permission. I have the text messages saved." Officer Hernandez studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He stepped away and spoke into his radio, his voice low but audible in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the apartment. "Dispatch, this is Hernandez. Possible trespassing in progress at the Morrison residence. Requesting homeowner verification and additional units for documentation." He turned back to me, pulling out his phone. "Miss Morrison, I'm going to need to verify some information with you. Can I call you directly to confirm your identity and statement?" "Of course," I said. My phone rang seconds later, the sound cutting through the lingering echo of the silenced alarm. I looked at the screen, saw the number, and answered on the first ring. "This is Catherine Morrison," I said. "I've been expecting this call." Officer Hernandez finished the verification and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He looked at me with a mixture of professional detachment and something that might have been curiosity. In his years on the force, he'd probably seen countless domestic disputes. But I suspected this one was different. Most intruders didn't wear designer clothes and claimed to be family. "Miss Morrison," he said, "I need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight. Are you willing to provide a statement?" "I am," I said. "But first, there's something you should see." I walked past him into the living room, moving slowly, deliberately. Amanda was still on the floor near my desk, her hands cuffed behind her back, her mascara smeared in dark streaks down her cheeks. When she saw me, she struggled to her feet, nearly losing her balance in the process. "Catherine, please," she said, her voice cracking. "Tell them this is a misunderstanding. I was worried about you. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." I did not look at her. If I looked at her face, I might see something human beneath the manipulation, something that would make what I was about to do more difficult than it needed to be. Instead, I walked to the bookshelf and retrieved the small camera that had been hidden there for months, nestled between my design manuals and the photograph from my college graduation. "Officer Hernandez," I said, handing him the device. This camera has been recording my apartment for the past 4 months. It's motion activated and timestamps every entry. What you'll find on it is documentation of 15 unauthorized entries, all occurring after I sent written notice to both my brother and his wife that they were no longer permitted to enter without my presence or permission. Hernandez took the camera and examined it, turning it over in his hands. 15 entries? 15 that I captured on video. There were more before I installed the camera. I have a written log of 19 incidents total, along with copies of the text messages I sent establishing my boundaries. I pulled my phone from my robe pocket and opened the message thread. Here, dated 4 weeks ago, I told them explicitly, "Do not enter when I'm not present. If you need to see me, call first." Hernandez scrolled through the messages, his expression hardening as he read. Behind him, the other officer had retrieved a laptop from the patrol car and was setting it up on my dining table. Within minutes, they'd connected the camera and begun reviewing the footage. The videos played in silence. Amanda entering through the front door with a key that shouldn't have existed. Amanda opening drawers, searching files, photographing documents with her phone. Amanda standing in my bedroom doorway, looking at my mother's jewelry box with an expression I could only describe as calculation. Each clip was timestamped, each one recorded after the date of my written warning, each one proving beyond any doubt that this was not a misunderstanding or a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a sustained, deliberate invasion of my privacy. "This is not the first time," I said, quietly. I gave her written notice to stop. She didn't. Hernandez nodded slowly, his jaw tight. He turned to the other officer and spoke in a low voice, too quiet for me to hear. Then he approached Amanda, who had gone very still, her eyes fixed on the laptop screen, where her own image moved through my apartment like a ghost. Before he could speak, the front door burst open. Julian stood in the doorway, his shirt untucked, his hair disheveled, his face a mask of panic. He must have driven here the moment he realized something was wrong, speeding through empty streets, praying he'd arrive in time to fix whatever had broken. But there was nothing left to fix. "What's going on?" he demanded, pushing past the officer at the door. "Catherine? Amanda?" His eyes swept the room, taking in the handcuffs, the police, the laptop still playing footage of his wife's crimes. "Officer, there must be some mistake. My wife would never." "Sir, I need you to stay calm," Hernandez said, holding up a hand. "Are you Julian Morrison?" "Yes, I'm her brother. What is happening here?" Hernandez gestured toward the laptop. "Perhaps you should see this." Julian walked to the table as if moving through water, each step slower than the last. He watched the footage in silence, his face draining of color as clip after clip played out before him. Amanda entering, Amanda searching, Amanda photographing documents that didn't belong to her. When the final video ended, Julian stood motionless, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Catherine, I swear I didn't know she was still." "You knew," I said. The words came out flat, without anger, without accusation. Simple fact. "You gave her the key. You defended her when I asked for boundaries. You told her to wait until I was weaker." Julian flinched as if I'd struck him. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. There was nothing he could say, no explanation that would erase what we both knew to be true. Officer Hernandez cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Amanda, "I'm placing you under arrest for criminal trespass. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Amanda began to sob, her shoulders shaking, her carefully constructed composure finally crumbling. Julian stood frozen between us, his wife in handcuffs on one side, his silent sister on the other. I watched him struggle, watched him search for a way out, a middle ground, a compromise that would let him avoid choosing. But there was no middle ground. There never had been. He'd simply pretended otherwise until pretending was no longer possible. The police took Amanda away in the back of a patrol car. I watched from my window as the red and blue lights faded down the street, disappearing around the corner like the end of a chapter I'd been waiting months to close. Julian stood on the sidewalk below, his hands hanging limp at his sides, staring at the empty space where his wife had been. He didn't look up at my window. Perhaps he couldn't bear to. The formal charges came the next morning. Officer Hernandez called to inform me that Amanda had been booked and processed, and that the district attorney's office would be reviewing the case. Criminal trespass, Class A misdemeanor, with the possibility of elevation to a felony given the repeated nature of the violations and the forced entry through the balcony door. If convicted, she faced up to 1 year in jail and a permanent criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. Bail had been set at $5,000. I thanked Hernandez for the update and asked him to keep me informed of any developments. He assured me he would. When the call ended, I sat in my chair and looked at my mother's photograph, at the smile she'd worn on her 65th birthday, at the Japanese garden rising behind us against the summer sky. I'd done what she'd asked. I'd protected my dignity, but the victory felt hollow, like winning a war that had destroyed everything worth saving. Julian called me 3 times that morning. I let each call go to voicemail, his messages growing increasingly desperate, his voice cracking as he pleaded for me to answer, to help, to explain what I wanted him to do. I didn't call back. There was nothing left to explain. He'd made his choices over months and years, small decisions that had accumulated into the wreckage now surrounding him. I could not undo those choices. I could only watch as he faced their consequences. Around noon, I went for my usual walk. The spring air was crisp, the cherry blossoms in full bloom, their petals falling like snow onto the sidewalks. When I returned, I saw Julian's car parked outside my building. He was sitting on the front steps, his head in his hands, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years overnight. I approached slowly, giving him time to notice me. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale and drawn. He stood and took a step toward me, then stopped, as if unsure whether he was still permitted to come closer. "Catherine, I need your help. The bail is $5,000. I went to the bank this morning to withdraw the money, but my card was declined. I checked the account, and there's almost nothing left. I don't understand. There should be more. There should be a lot more." His voice broke on the last word. "I called Amanda, but she won't answer. I don't know what's happening." And then I studied my brother's face, searching for some sign of the boy I'd grown up with, the young man who'd once looked at me with trust and admiration. All I saw was confusion and fear, the expression of someone who built his life on a foundation he'd never thought to examine. All I saw was confusion and fear. A few months later, I convinced him. I said, "Julian blinked. What does that mean?" And, "It means that whatever is happening with your money is not my problem to solve. You chose to give Amanda control over your life. You chose to stand silent while she violated my boundaries. You chose to wait until I was weaker." I let the words settle between us. And then, I closed the door, steadily. "Now you're discovering what those choices have cost you. I can't help you with that. Only you can." And then says, "Catherine, please. She's my wife. Whatever she did, I can't just leave her in jail. Then find another way to post bail. Sell something. Borrow from a friend. But don't ask me to pay for the consequences of her actions. I've spent 6 months paying for them already." Stared at me, his mouth working silently, searching for an argument that would change my mind. Strong. After a long moment, he turned and walked back to his car, his shoulders hunched, his footsteps heavy on the pavement. And pause. I watched him drive away and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity. Just the quiet emptiness of a relationship that had been hollowed out from the inside. End pause. That evening, I received one more call from Julian. This time I answered. "Catherine," he said, and his voice was different now, smaller, frightened. "I've been looking at our bank statements, the ones Amanda always handled. I never checked them myself. I trusted her." I said nothing. "There are withdrawals I don't recognize, transfers to accounts I've never heard of, loans taken out in my name that I never signed for." He paused, and I heard him swallow hard. "Catherine, I think she's been stealing from us, from me, for years." I closed my eyes and thought of my mother's letter. "I know your sister-in-law. I've seen how she looks at what we've built. I've watched her calculate the value of things that should have no price." My mother had seen the truth long before any of us. She'd tried to warn me. And now Julian was discovering what I'd learned months ago, that the person he trusted most had never deserved that trust. "How much?" I asked. "I don't know yet. Tens of thousands at least, maybe more." His voice cracked again. "I don't know what to do." "Then I suggest you find out," I said. "Start with the statements, follow the money, and when you understand what she's done, you'll have to decide what kind of man you want to be." I hung up before he could respond. There was nothing more I could say. Julian had finally opened his eyes, but the journey ahead was his alone to walk. All I could do was wait and see whether my brother would find the courage to face the truth, or whether he would retreat into the comfortable blindness that had brought him here. The numbers I suspected would not add up, and when Julian finally saw the full extent of Amanda's betrayal, he would have to choose who he wanted to become. 3 days passed before I heard from Julian again. 3 days of silence, of waiting, of wondering what he'd found in those bank statements, and whether the truth had broken him or set him free. I didn't call him. I didn't visit. Whatever storm was raging through his life, he needed to face it alone before he could face me. When he finally appeared at my door, I barely recognized him. The man standing in my hallway looked like a shadow of my brother, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them for days. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked past me into the living room and sank onto the couch, staring at the floor with the blank expression of someone who'd seen too much to process. $63,000, he said without preamble. That's how much she took. Loans in my name, credit cards I never applied for, transfers to accounts that don't exist anymore. He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "She forged my signature, Catherine, on everything. I compared the documents to my actual handwriting. It's close, but it's not mine. She practiced until she got it right." I sat down across from him and waited. There was more coming. I could see it in the way he held himself, the tension in his shoulders, the tremor in his hands. "I confronted her," he continued, "after she made bail. Someone from her office paid it. I don't even know who. She came home like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just spent 2 nights in jail for breaking into my sister's apartment." He shook his head slowly. I showed her the statements. I showed her the forged signatures. I asked her to explain. Julian's jaw tightened. "She said she did it for our family. She said if the investments had worked out, we'd be rich. She said I should be thanking her for trying to build something instead of blaming her for taking a risk." His voice cracked. "She wasn't sorry, Catherine. She was angry. Angry that I found out. Angry that her plans didn't work. She looked at me like I was the one who'd betrayed her. I thought of all the times Amanda had smiled at me, had asked about my health, had offered to help with my finances. I thought of the brochures for assisted living, the questions about my investments, the methodical searches through my desk and filing cabinet. The picture that had been forming for months finally came into complete focus. She was searching my apartment for money, I said. It wasn't a question. Julian nodded miserably. She was desperate. The debts were piling up faster than she could cover them. She thought maybe you had cash hidden somewhere, or documents she could use, or something she could sell without you noticing. He looked up at me, his eyes wet. All those times she said she was checking on you, she was looking for a way out of the hole she dug. The concern was never real. It was always about what she could take. The confirmation should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like grief. I'd suspected Amanda's motives for months, had documented her intrusions, had prepared for exactly this moment. Hearing my brother speak the words aloud, hearing him finally acknowledge what I'd known all along, brought no satisfaction. Only sadness for the years we'd lost, the trust that had been squandered, the family that had been hollowed out by one woman's greed. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Julian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know. The debt is in my name. I'm legally responsible for all of it, even if I press charges for fraud. It could take years to sort out, and there's no guarantee I'd win." He rubbed his face with both hands. "My wife is a criminal. My sister won't speak to me. My money is gone. I don't know what's left." I didn't offer comfort. I didn't tell him everything would be all right. Those would have been lies, and Julian had been surrounded by lies for long enough. "You have a choice to make," I said instead. "The same choice you've had all along. You can keep protecting the life you built with her, or you can start building something honest. But you cannot do both." Julian sat in silence, absorbing my words. Then he stood, walked to the door, and paused with his hand on the knob. "Catherine," he said without turning around, "I need to see you, really see you. Not like this, not in crisis. I need to sit with you and talk the way we used to before Mom died." His voice broke. "Please. I don't have anyone else left." I looked at my brother, at the broken man standing in my doorway, and felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it, distant and fragile, waiting to see what he would do next. "Call me tomorrow," I said. "We'll talk then. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you." Julian called the next morning as I'd asked. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the confident tone he'd carried for years, reduced to something raw and uncertain. We agreed to meet at my apartment that afternoon. No Amanda, no excuses, just the two of us, sister and brother, for the first time in longer than I could remember. When he arrived, I barely recognized the man who walked through my door. The exhaustion I'd seen the day before had deepened into something more permanent, carved into the lines around his eyes, the slump of his shoulders, the way he moved like someone carrying a weight too heavy to bear. He had aged a decade in less than a week. The confident professional, the brother who'd always deferred to his wife. All of those masks had fallen away, leaving only a 42-year-old man who looked utterly lost. He sat across from me in the living room, in the same chair where Amanda had once spread her assisted living brochures across my table. The irony was not lost on me. He folded his hands in his lap and stared at them for a long moment before speaking. He sat across from me in the living room, in the same chair where Amanda had once spread her assisted living brochures across my table. "I didn't know she was capable of—" "You knew," I said. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't soften them. Julian looked up, startled, and I held his gaze without flinching. "You knew," I repeated. "Maybe not the details, maybe not the full extent, but you knew something was wrong. You knew she was entering my apartment without permission. You knew she was searching through my things. You knew I'd asked her to stop, and you knew she hadn't." I paused, letting the silence stretch between us. "You chose not to see. That's not the same as not knowing." Julian's face crumpled. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, to offer some explanation that would absolve him of responsibility. But no words came. Because there were no words, we both knew the truth, and the truth didn't require debate. "There's something I need to show you," I said. I went to the drawer where I'd kept my mother's letters and retrieved the one she'd left for me. The paper was soft from handling, the creases worn from the many times I'd unfolded and refolded it over the past weeks. I carried it back to my chair and sat down, holding it carefully, as if it might crumble at any moment. Mom wrote this before she died, I said. She left it for me, hidden in a place where I'd find it only when I needed it most. I looked at Julian, at the confusion and fear in his eyes. She knew, Julian. She knew what Amanda was, and she tried to warn me. I unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. Catherine, if you're reading this, you're probably feeling alone. I know your brother loves you, but I also know your sister-in-law. I've seen how she looks at what we've built. Don't let anyone take your dignity. If your boundaries are violated, walk away. Don't explain. Don't beg for understanding. Just walk away. I believe in you. The words hung in the air between us. Julian sat frozen, his face pale, his breathing shallow. I watched him process what he'd heard, watched the realization dawn that our mother had seen through him too. Mom hadn't trusted her own son to protect his sister. She'd written this letter because she knew Julian would fail, knew he would stand silent, knew he would choose the path of least resistance until there was nothing left to resist. Mom wrote that, Julian whispered. She did. She knew before any of this happened. She knew. I folded the letter and set it aside. Your mother saw people clearly. It was one of her greatest gifts. She saw Amanda for what she was, and she saw you for what you were becoming. Julian broke then, not the controlled tears of a man trying to maintain composure, but the raw, heaving sobs of someone whose entire understanding of himself had shattered. He wept for our mother, for the trust she'd withheld, for the faith she'd placed in me instead of him. He wept for the years he'd spent deferring to his wife, for the boundaries he'd allowed her to cross, for the sister he'd failed to defend. I let him cry. I didn't comfort him. Comfort would have been a kindness he had not yet earned. Instead, I spoke the truth he needed to hear, the truth that had been building inside me for months. I lost my mother, I said quietly. That was the hardest thing I've ever survived, but I did survive it. I learned to live with the absence, to carry the grief, to wake up every morning in a world that felt too empty and keep going anyway. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. But you, Julian, you lost my respect, and that was your choice. Every time you stood silent while she diminished me, you chose her comfort over my dignity. Every time you looked away when I asked for help, you told me that keeping peace with your wife mattered more than keeping faith with your sister. Julian looked up, his face streaked with tears, his eyes swollen and red. I didn't mean to. Intent doesn't matter, I said. Actions matter. You acted like a coward and I lost respect for you. That is the truth, and no amount of apology will change it. The words were harsh, but they were honest. Julian needed honesty now, more than he needed comfort. He'd spent years wrapped in Amanda's lies. The least I could give him was the clarity of truth. He sat in silence for a long time, absorbing what I'd said. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier, though still fragile around the edges. I'm leaving her, he said. I've already talked to a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked at me, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. Catherine, can I come stay with you, just until I get back on my feet? I don't have anywhere else to go. The question hung in the air between us, fragile and desperate. I looked at my brother, at the broken man sitting across from me, and felt the weight of 39 years pressing down on my shoulders. I'd been there for him through everything, helped him with his homework, loaned him money when he needed it, stood beside him at his wedding. I'd been there for every milestone, every stumble, every moment when he needed someone to catch him before he fell. And now he was asking me to catch him again, to open my door and my home, to provide the safety net he'd always assumed would be there. I thought of my mother's letter. Don't live someone else's life for them. For years, I hadn't understood what she meant. I'd read those words as advice about self-preservation, about protecting my own boundaries against those who would violate them. But sitting here now, looking at my brother's expectant face, I finally understood the deeper meaning. My mother hadn't just been warning me about Amanda. She'd been warning me about Julian too, about the danger of loving someone so much that you shield them from the consequences of their own choices. No, I said. The word fell between us like a stone into still water. Julian blinked, confusion flickering across his face, as if he hadn't heard correctly. What? No, I repeated. You cannot stay here. Julian stared at me, his mouth slightly open, his eyes searching my face for some sign that I was joking, testing him, playing some kind of cruel game. He found nothing. I kept my expression calm, my voice steady, even as my heart ached with the effort of what I was doing. Catherine, I don't understand. I have nowhere else to go. Amanda took everything. The house is mortgaged beyond what it's worth. I can't afford rent on my own, not with the debt she left me. His voice rose, panic creeping in at the edges. I'm your brother. You can't just turn me away. I'm not turning you away, I said. I'm refusing to rescue you. What's the difference? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, looking directly into his eyes. Julian, I love you. I've loved you since the day you were born, and I will love you until the day I die. But you are 42 years old. You don't need an apartment. You need to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. Julian shook his head, as if he could physically reject what I was saying. I don't understand. You've always been there for me. When I needed help with college, you were there. When I needed money for the wedding, you were there. Why is this different? Because those were investments in your future, I said. This would be enabling your past. I paused, gathering my thoughts, wanting to say this exactly right. Mom moved something else in that letter, something I didn't read to you before. She wrote, "Don't live someone else's life for them." I didn't understand it at first. I thought she was talking about Amanda, about not letting someone else control my decisions. But now I realize she was also talking about you. Julian's face crumpled. What does that mean? It means I spent too many years making things easy for you. Every time you faced a hard choice, I was there to soften the landing. Every time you made a mistake, I was there to clean it up. I thought I was being a good sister. I thought I was showing love. I shook my head slowly, but I wasn't. I was teaching you that consequences don't apply to you, that someone would always be there to fix what you broke. And that's not love, Julian. That's enabling. That's not fair, Julian said, his voice cracking. I didn't ask for any of this, Amanda. Amanda made her choices, but you made yours too, I said. You chose to let her handle the finances without oversight. You chose to stand silent when she violated my boundaries. You chose to wait until I was weaker, instead of standing up for what was right. I let the words settle before continuing. Those were your choices, Julian, not hers, yours. And now you need to live with the consequences. Julian sat in stunned silence. I could see him struggling to process what was happening, to reconcile the sister who'd always said yes, with the woman now saying no. His world had already been shattered by Amanda's betrayal. Now I was refusing to help him pick up the pieces. I will always be here if you need to talk, I said, softening my tone slightly. If you want to have dinner, call me. If you need advice, I'll listen. If you're in genuine danger, I will help. But I will not save you from the consequences of choices you made. I paused. That's not love, Julian. That's enabling, and I enabled you long enough. So what am I supposed to do? His voice was barely a whisper. Figure it out, I said. Find a small apartment you can afford. Get a second job if you need to. Talk to a financial advisor about managing the debt. Do whatever it takes to rebuild your life from the ground up. You're capable of more than you think. You just never had to prove it because I was always there to make things easier. Well, I'm not making things easier anymore. It's time for you to discover who you are when no one is there to catch you. Julian sat motionless for a long moment. I watched emotions flicker across his face. Anger, disbelief, hurt, and finally, something that might have been the first glimmer of understanding. He didn't argue further. Perhaps he knew, somewhere deep inside, that I was right. Or perhaps he was simply too exhausted to fight. He stood slowly, his movements heavy with defeat. He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the knob, his back to me. I thought he might say something. A final plea, an angry accusation, a grudging acknowledgement. But he said nothing. He simply opened the door and stepped through it. I didn't call out. I didn't tell him to wait. I didn't change my mind. I sat in my chair and watched my brother walk away, his shoulders hunched, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded into silence. The door closed quietly behind him. The apartment felt emptier than it had in months. I looked at my mother's photograph, at the smile that had guided me through the darkest moments of my life, and I whispered the only words that felt true. I hope I did the right thing. The photograph didn't answer, but somewhere in the silence, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. And I knew that my mother, wherever she was, understood. 6 months can change everything. 6 months can tear down what took years to build, or it can lay the foundation for something new. In the half year since Julian walked out of my apartment, I watched both kinds of change unfold. Destruction and renewal, endings and beginnings, the slow turning of seasons that carries life forward, whether we're ready or not. Amanda's trial concluded in early autumn. The evidence was overwhelming. The camera footage, the bank records, the forged signatures, the testimony of neighbors and building staff who'd witnessed her comings and goings. She pleaded guilty to criminal trespass and fraud, hoping for leniency. The judge was not moved. She received 18 months probation, 300 hours of community service, and a court order to repay every dollar she'd stolen from Julian. Her name appeared in the local newspaper, a small article buried in the back pages, but enough to ensure that everyone in their community knew what she'd done. Within weeks, she'd lost her job. Within a month, she'd filed for divorce. Or perhaps Julian had filed first. I never asked for the details. By winter, she'd moved away. Destination unknown. Her reputation in ruins. Her schemes collapsed around her like a house built on sand. I didn't attend the trial. I didn't need to watch her fall. The satisfaction I might have felt had long since faded into something quieter, something closer to indifference. Amanda had been a storm that passed through my life, leaving damage in her wake. But storms end. What matters is what remains when the clouds clear. Julian found a small apartment on the other side of town, a studio in a building without charm or distinction. He took a second job to manage the debt, working weekends at a hardware store where no one knew his history or his shame. We spoke every Sunday, brief conversations that lasted 10 or 15 minutes, covering the small details of our separate lives. He told me about his work, his apartment, the cooking skills he was slowly developing out of necessity. I told him about my projects at the firm, my morning walks, the books I was reading. We didn't discuss Amanda or the trial or the money she'd stolen. Those wounds were still too fresh to touch. But something had changed in my brother. I could hear it in his voice, a steadiness that hadn't been there before, a willingness to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. He was learning, slowly, what it meant to face consequences without someone to shield him. He was discovering strengths he'd never needed to use. I didn't know if we would ever fully repair what had been broken between us. But for the first time in years, I believed it might be possible. My own life settled into a rhythm I'd almost forgotten. I watered my mother's jasmine plant every morning, watching it bloom and fade and bloom again with the turning of the seasons. I took my walks at dawn, following the familiar route through the neighborhood, nodding to the same faces, breathing the same air I'd breathed for years. Gloria Chen joined me sometimes, falling into step beside me without needing to fill the silence with conversation. We walked together like old friends, comfortable in each other's presence, grateful for the company without demanding more than either of us could give. I was not lonely. That was the surprise I had not expected. For months after my mother's death, I'd feared loneliness more than almost anything. The empty apartment, the silent meals, the long evenings with no one to share them. But loneliness, I discovered, is not the same as being alone. Loneliness is wanting connection and finding none. Being alone is a choice, a decision to live on your own terms, to fill your days with meaning that doesn't depend on anyone else's presence. I had made that choice, and in making it, I'd found a peace I hadn't known was possible. On a quiet morning in late winter, I took my mother's letter from the drawer where I'd kept it for nearly a year. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases with my fingers, and read her words one final time. They'd guided me through the darkest months of my life, had given me the courage to protect my dignity when everything I loved seemed to be slipping away. I owed her more than I could ever repay. When I finished reading, I folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. I stored it in the drawer, beside the library card, the jewelry box, the small treasures of a life we'd built together. Then I closed the drawer and whispered to the photograph on my shelf, "You were right. I walked away, and I'm still here." I made my coffee and carried it to the window, settling into my chair as the first light of dawn crept over the rooftops. The sky shifted from gray to gold, the world waking slowly around me. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need reconciliation. I had something better, something I'd earned through months of patience and pain and quiet determination. I had peace. The apartment was quiet, but for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like freedom. Every story leaves a mark, and this one is no exception. Catherine Morrison didn't set out to destroy her sister-in-law or teach her brother a lesson. She simply wanted what every person deserves: respect, privacy, and the right to live on her own terms. When those boundaries were violated, she didn't retaliate with anger or cruelty. She responded with patience, documentation, and quiet resolve. She let the truth speak for itself, and in the end, the truth was enough. Her mother's letter was more than a warning. It was a gift, a final act of love from a woman who knew her daughter better than she knew herself. She understood that kindness could be exploited, that family could become a weapon, and that sometimes walking away is the bravest thing a person can do. Catherine honored her mother's wisdom, and in doing so, she reclaimed the dignity that had been slowly stripped away. This story reminds us that boundaries are not walls meant to keep people out. They are declarations of self-worth, statements that say, "I matter, my peace matters, and I will not sacrifice either for the comfort of those who refuse to respect them." If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to protect yourself from someone who mistook your kindness for weakness? Have you faced the painful choice between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your story might be the one that helps someone else find the courage to stand their ground. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more stories of resilience, justice, and the quiet power of self-respect, because sometimes the loudest victories are the ones that come from knowing when to walk away. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, your dignity is not negotiable. Protect it fiercely, and never apologize for honoring yourself. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and know that somewhere out there, someone believes in your strength.